Hi there! Hi everyone. Today I'm working on a custom that I've been wanting to make for a long time. Back when I first started watching Leona's videos, I even wanted to kit bash garage kits to make the character. Anyway, the character is Ashura from Rigveda by Clamp, who are known for series like Tsubasa, Chobits, Cardcaptor Sakura, and so on. It's one of the lesser known series, but also their first non-doujin manga. Back when I first found our, at the time, only local anime store, they had a Clamp no Kiseki book with the chess pieces, and that issue in particular focused on this series. The series is inspired by the Hindu Rigveda mythology, and Ashura is one of the main characters. They appeared in a Tsubasa arc along with Yashao, and the series had a two episode OVA and an appearance in the second Clamp in Wonderland short. So the series isn't all that well known. And Ashura was my favorite character, even though there was another character that confirms more to my usual aesthetics, and I'm going to make the adult version of Ashura. Even though Ashura appears more childlike form most of the series, I already have a chibi Ashura chess piece, and the adult Ashura is just so pretty. So, onto the customization. I'm using an S-size sozai-chan in pale flesh as a base, and I temporarily put my figma Hikaru's head on, as I originally wanted to make molds of her face to use for Ashura, considering they're the same era Clamp art style, but Hikaru's head is not slim enough for what I want for Ashura. I traced the shape of the sozai-chan body, including the joints, onto a piece of paper, and marked most of the basic changes I'd have to make. Then I copied that, cut the copy into pieces, and stuck it together in a way that shortens the torso, lengthens the legs, and I continued determining other adjustments. The proportions in the manga are all over the place, so I'm using my best judgment to make it look as close to the character as possible. But two things are important: tall and skinny. I'll add an example on screen. I take a third piece of paper to trace the cut and pasted picture and add the skirt to make sure I like the silhouette. And at this time, I'm not sure if I want to lengthen the arms as well. So I started by removing the joints at the neck and torso and filling the cavities with my epoxy putty. After the putty cures, I use my Dremel tool to cut the thighs in half, and I drill holes in both sides and connect them with a wire at the length I want and fill the gaps with my epoxy putty. I also start adding the putty to the lower legs for the leg guard thingies. Then I start joining the panties to the torso with my putty. It was quite finicky, so it took a while. And I stick my excess putty on a wire and aluminium foil frame to start with the huge ponytail. I use my Dremel sanding bit to carve down the thighs, as I want them skinny, like the art style. And I constantly check with my sketches so I don't go overboard or don't sand down enough. And I also sand down the leg holes on the panty to increase posability. Onto the torso. I cut it in half before sanding down the lower torso by a whole lot, sanding down the breasts, since Ashura is a genderless character, and making a cavity in the upper torso. I also drill new holes for the torso joint. Next, I add some putty to the legs to go over where I sanded, and I sanded too much. And I sand the back of the thighs so the knees can bend better. And once that's cured, I sand it smooth by hand, and I go back and forth until I'm happy with the shape. Off screen, I used my putty to work more on the leg warmers or leg guard thingies, and I sanded down the neck and defined the collarbone. When sanding, I start with a very low grit, usually 100, and then I move to 400, and then 1000, and then I use my nail buffer to finish off. Next, the skirt. I especially found some cosplay to use for this project, even though it's not really available here, but somebody was willing to sell me a piece. Unfortunately, it took a while to get a hang of it. My first skirt turned out looking pretty good, but the flexibility wasn't that great, so I remade it. The first version pretty much folded the clay like fabric by pinching it and arranging it on the foil to keep its shape during baking. But I later wanted to add a wire to pose it more, but that ended up a mess on the underside of the skirt. Later it also cracked due to me manhandling it. For both versions I started out with a pattern, but for the second one it was noticeably smaller. Please note that I only took pictures of the process of the second one and didn't record. I started out with a trapezium-like shape, with the width of the waistband for the front piece and the back piece a bit wider, so it can wrap around the butt. The clay is rolled out onto a thicker piece of aluminium foil. Then I pressed thin wires into the sides, not too deep, but not too close to the edge either. Too deep and it's ugly and visible, too close to the edge and it's really difficult to cover with clay. Then I added the clay on top of the wires and using my sculpting tool to blend the clay in. After the wires were concealed, I added strips of clay where I wanted the folds to be and blended the strips in. After the folds, I bent the aluminium foil so that the shape is kept around the waist and that the entire skirt has some natural flow to it. After that, I bake it and sand it smooth. After securing the first skirt to the lower torso and adding cling wrap over it, I get out my epoxy to sculpt the waistband, starting with some snakes of clay. I do this over more than one pass while comparing to my sketch and using a ball tool to make sure that there's a space for the joint I'll be using. Then I start adding some volume to the upper torso piece and sculpting some fabric folds. Ashura's shirt is also an anomaly and I struggled to make sense of what exactly is going on, as it's obviously a lot of flowing fabric, but in a way it's puffed out at the waist and more compact at the chest. It's kinda hard to explain. I don't know what kind of anti-gravity is keeping the clothes in place. I also tried to sculpt some folds onto the leg guard thingies for a more visual interest, since I technically could just leave it plain. But anyway, after curing I used wood carving tools to define the shapes and then sand. I used my black rock shooter figma's head back, since it's a similar hairstyle, to make a mold, so that I can sculpt the head back for Ashura on the mold. I start with little bits of clay so I can be sure it goes into all the nooks and crannies. I also made a mold piece to go inside the chin, so that there's space for the neck joint, so I don't have to struggle when sculpting the face later. Once the head back has cured, I take it and the chin and put a good coat of petroleum jelly onto it. Then I carefully start with the face, squeezing my clay into all the holes and making the basic face shape. Once the clay starts to semi-harden, I start with some more accurate detailing. I added 2 pieces of wire, which would form the base of the ears, and on the next pass of epoxy I did add the ears. Unfortunately, because it's so small, I ended up working close to my face, so there's not a lot of footage. But a few things to note: try to keep the face on the flatter side, and be careful so you don't break the pointy bits like the nose and the ears. And also take care when sanding. I had to do several rounds of sanding, starting from very low grit to very high grit, and in the end even using a nail buffer to make sure everything was perfectly smooth. Otherwise you see all the scratches from the sandpaper on the paint, beneath the paint. I also did a test draw of the face on the test draw on the face to see if I'm more receptive with what it looks like. After that was done, I gave it a coat of primer and made a mold. I originally thought of sculpting each face, but it took me over a week to just polish up and finish this one face, so I decided to make a mold and cast the other faces in resin. Next, I get out my cast clay again to make the sleeves and scarfy thingy. The scarfy thingy is basically a strip of clay that has wire embedded into one side. Though not as neatly as done as the second version of the skirt, since that was done later. I also add some pleats and frills for more texture. At one point I thought of painting some gold details on, like in some illustrations, but I kept it plain to have a more familiar look. After all the painting and sealing was done for the entire project, I used my epoxy to attach the scarfy thingy to the shoulder, as my glue just made a mess. The sleeves went through a few iterations as well, but the ones I ended up happy with were made by wrapping aluminium foil over the shoulder and adding the clay over that, smoothing out places and adding frills or folds or pleats or whatever to the edges. Then I carefully removed them and baked them. After I'm done with most of the carving and sanding on the head back, I get out the drill a hole in the head back and add a joint catcher and a joint for the eventual ponytail. Then I get out my epoxy, this time some brand new Tamiya 2-part epoxy, and start sculpting some details like the arm jewelry and the ring from Gige, which Ashura uses as a hair tie. The arm jewelry has quite a few renditions in the manga, just like other things, but sometimes it's plain and sometimes it has gems or other decorations. So I went with my own middle ground design. The hair ring also has some variations, but I went with the most recurring one. For both, I had not added the gem just yet, as I want to do them in resin. I also start sculpting the arm guard thingies, just like how I sculpted the leg guard thingies. I put my face on the head back and smother them both in petroleum jelly, so I can start sculpting the front hairpiece. Once again, starting slowly by smooshing the epoxy into the crevices to make sure that it has a perfect fit. But I start the hair with a vague blob and embedded wires for the bangs later. Then I sculpt the fabric on the shoulders, on the torso, making sure to leave a space for the scarfy thingy to be glued in, or rather epoxied into later. After the paticures, I work on the front hairpiece again, sculpting some finer strands. I also use some wire and epoxy to make the necklace and the jewel that goes into the hair ring. And after curing, I made a mold so I can cast them in resin later. After curing, I once again add more fine strands to the front hairpiece. It was quite difficult to settle on a look, as in the manga panels the hair is pretty much flying all over the place, as well in most illustrations. That or you can't see what's going on. Later I used some screenshots from the Clamp in Wonderland shorts as a reference, and I reached something I was happy with. I then belatedly remembered Ashura's Tsubasa rendition, which I probably could have used as a reference as well. Then I spent quite a while reproducing the design for the Shurato's sword handle and printing it out as a reference and as a to-scale version to my figure. I first cut out the to-scale version, placed it on a sheet of epoxy to cut out the shape, and then sculpt according to my reference. But I can tell you, it wasn't easy trying to cram all that detail into something so tiny. Anyway, I sculpt only one side, so symmetry is important. Then I bulk up the ponytail with the excess epoxy, adding some strands, details and covering the whole thing. I had a bit of a struggle to deciding on what length Ashura's hair should be, because in the manga it goes from waist length to butt length to knee length to ankle length, and the length is all over the place. After that cured, like before, I carve and sand the heck out of the thing to make it look presentable. I have noticed a lot of the time that hair on my figures at least don't look as nice without this method. So I use my Dremel tool for some detail sanding where I can't reach as well. Next, I try to make the blade of the Shurato kinda like the light folded with her Silvally doll, but it didn't work out like I wanted, so later I tried something else. So I made this mold of my sword handle and the ponytail, and I'm going to use resin to fill them. For the gems, necklace and sword handle, I ended up using red pigment powder to mix into the resin. I made 2 copies of my sword handle. Next, I start pouring clear resin into my hair mold, then mixing a tiny bit of black pigment powder, pouring into my mold, more black pigment powder, pouring it into my mold, and so on to get a clear to opaque gradient on the hair. I actually had to make it a few times when the casting ended up flawed with some bubbles or strands not being filled or the gradient looking bad. I even unmolded one too early and it half melted as it cured. I poured my excess resin into a coaster mold. And somewhere along the line I made 5 faces from my mold with resin. Then I got my cosplay out again, remade the sleeves like I said before, and mixed in some black pigment powder and black pastel powder into some of my cosplay to turn it close to black. And I used that to sculpt the bangs onto the wires that I left on the front hairpiece, so that they can be posable as well. It was actually quite finicky as I had to be careful not to break anything, and there isn't much space to hold on to while sculpting. After I filled in all the bubbles on my ponytail hairpiece with UV resin, I sanded it and drilled a hole for the joint to go into. And using some resin and pigment powder, I filled in the gaps. For the Shorato's blade, this time I cut a piece of clear plastic from packaging into the shape of the blade and used UV resin to glue it between the 2 sword handle pieces I made before. Then I took a larger piece of clear plastic, scored a line, folded it on the line, and then added UV resin onto that. Then I placed my sword blade that's attached to the handle onto that resin and cure. And after cutting away the excess plastic and resin, I repeat on the other side. Then I sprayed most of my custom parts with my grey primer and used my glossy black Tamiya enamel paints to paint some of them black. I originally wanted to add a holographic effect to Ashura's hair, because why not? Ashura be pretty, there's no reason their hair can't be pretty. So I tried that, but my so-called holographic powder was silver with holographic glitter in it. So that didn't work, and I had to clean it off later. Then I got my Tamiya gold enamel paint, but it wasn't the color I wanted, so I mixed my gold pigment powder with my glass instead and painted all the gold parts. My sword handle, the arm jewelry, the necklace and the earring. After that dried, I used some black acrylic paint to add some weathering to the gold parts before sealing it. Then, instead of holographic powder, I used a red to blue color shift chameleon powder, mixed that in with my gloss and added that all over the hair, except the flexible parts. So in some angles the lighting makes the hair shine blue, and in other lighting and hair angles the hair shines red. Kinda representing the 2 Ashuras, if you know what I mean. Also, just a note, make sure your gloss or other varnish is compatible with your paint. My gloss turned my Tamiya enamel painting into a gloopy mess, so I had to clean, then repaint, spray it with my matte sealant before adding the glass in the end. Why not get another glass that's compatible? Because it's expensive and this one is strong and I'm familiar with it. Anyway, I added a matte coat to my hair so that it wasn't weirdly shiny. Next, I glued the gem I made with resin to the hair ring and mixed some UV resin with red pigment to make the gem on the arm jewelry before adding a gloss to the gems. So, here's a fancy base made of the excess resin. I drilled a hole into it for the stand, and I'm using a Tamashi Stage Act humanoid base and stand for Ashura. I'm also adding bowl pieces to my shoulder joints to help them stay in place in the torso while drilling bigger holes for the ball joints into the shoulder sockets. For my faces, after a layer of primer, I draw on what expressions I want them to have before using my nail art bits in my Dremel to carve out new details, which was mainly the mouths. Then I used some Tamiya putty to fill in the holes and gaps made during dremeling before sanding everything smooth and removing the primer. Since the S-size sozai-chan doesn't come with spread open hands, I made a mold from the hands from a normal sozai-chan and made a pair in resin, which I had quite a few bubbles to fill up, along with my faces. And remember what I said about breaking pointy bits? Here I'm re-sculpting a nose. Painting the faces was a story. I originally tried to do it by hand, which ended up ugly, so I cleaned it off and finally sealed myself to get an airbrush. I had been thinking of it for quite a while, but this was the last straw. I also had a heck of a learning curve trying to use an airbrush. And here's a summary. Day 1, I add the paint, and just as I turn on the compressor, the battery starts dying. Day 2, battery charged, and second attempt, but it dies again. Day 3, new battery, and it works, but I didn't clean properly the day before, so the paint won't come out. Clean everything, and with a bit of struggling with thinning the paint, and it works. 3/4 of the way through, the compressor acts weird. I check the inside is partially broken. I super glue what I can and use epoxy as reinforcement. Day 4. Put the compressor back together, but it doesn't spray the paint. Clean everything 6 times, but still not working. I check to see that the paint is coming out, but not spraying. I look it up online, and it means there's not enough pressure. But it worked the previous day. The compressor can't adjust the pressure, so it's dead. Anyway, new compressor. The primer works. Next up, paint. Paint dries lighter than a wet paint, so a paint mixing struggle ensues. But after that, I got the hang of it. Anyway, my primer also had a tragedy. Lol. I was moving my stuff to another room since I didn't want anything to breathing in the fumes, and this was after I cleaned. There was a spider on the scene of the accident who died from the fumes. So yeah, keep the shit away from living creatures and wear a proper respirator. I did save most of the primer though. After primer, I sprayed the skin tone parts, sealed and masked off the skin tone parts, and then I sprayed the white parts. I decided against adding shading since it can get messy, and it seems I never mentioned sculpting some new underwear details. Now onto the final stage of the figure, painting the faces. I start sketching out the eyes with a brown watercolor pencil. Once I'm happy with that, I go over the lines with black acrylic paint, and once the paint is dry, I use water to remove the pencil. Next, I use brown paint to do the eyelid creases and the closed mouths, and some details around the eyebrows for the crying and shouting faces. Then, I use some pink for the mouths for the open mouth expressions. Then I used white for the sclera and the tears of a crying face and the teeth of the smirk face. I originally wasn't going to make a crying face, but after rereading the manga, I felt it necessary since Ashura cries a lot. Then I used yellow to paint the irises, and after making sure I'm happy with the faces, which was kinda hard at this point since they looked a bit wonky for some reason, I had sealed my progress. After that, I used some orange and black watercolor pencils to add the pupils and the depth in the eyes. And then I finished them off with some eye shines. The eye shines really bring the faces together and make them look good. Then I used some black to add sideburns to make it look more natural on the figure. And then the figure was done. Well, except for attaching the skirt pieces to each other with epoxy, making them a separate piece for if I ever wanted to do a short skirt. And then the figure is done. It's not filmed. Now onto the last, more optional accessories. We're in the last stretch, people. First off, the musical instrument, which appears in the arc in Tsubasa, which is technically not canon to the Veda series, but why not? It was the highest voted item on a poll on myfigurecollection.net. Since it's pretty big, I'm going to make it from balsa wood, so that it's lightweight. I sketched out the parts on paper, then on several thicknesses of wood, I used my sister's saw thing to cut the wood, after which I drew the details on in pencil. Next, I used toothpicks as a base for the tuners, making holes where they'll go and cutting them to sides before putting them aside. Then I sculpted decorative bumps on top of the instrument before sanding off the excess wood where I wasn't accurate in cutting. I used my carve knife to carve some details. Only on the edges do I carve parts horizontally for 3D texture, because the other parts look more painted on rather than carved on. Next, I sand the heck out of the main body piece to get the shape I want, and then sand with a lower grit sandpaper to smooth things out. After that, I glued the pieces together in several steps so that nothing moves or falls apart. Next, I used my epoxy to make the tuners. I had a bit of trouble as the epoxy didn't want to stick to the toothpicks for some reason, and I'll have to sand it afterwards. Next accessory is a decapitated head. Why? Referencing this image of the manga of Evil Ashura, of course. You've probably seen snippets in other parts of the video, but I didn't specifically record it by accident. Anyway, there was a miscast faceplate, which I stuck onto a ball of aluminium foil and stabbed a toothpick into it to hold it. I altered the nose bridge to be different from Ashura's face, and then sculpted the neck and ears, and then I started the hair. Honestly, I didn't pay that much attention to it, especially as it's going to be painted gory, so details won't be as noticeable. Also, in the manga, there is pretty often mentioned that Ashura wants to eat meat, and that they're hungry, but it's not shown at all. So I opted out of making something, but I had a bowl of epoxy left, so chicken drumstick it is. Considering the amount of detail visible in the series, I had no clue how far to go, so I kept it kinda simple. After that, it's paint. I started with the head with some badly mixed skin tone from earlier. Then I used black to paint the eyes, mouth, brows, and the deepest crevices in the hair. Then I used the yellow as a highlight all over the hair. Then a lighter brown. Then a darker brown, before smothering it in red for blood and glossing it up, the blood. I painted the chicken leg kinda like I did the hair on the head. The interstiment was started off with white acrylic paint all over. I did dilute the paint a bit so I don't use my detailing. Then I used mixes of yellow, green, white and blue paint for the stems of the designs. It was pretty difficult since I suck at blending with acrylics. Then a purple, pink and white mix for the flowers, which despite having less colors was more difficult. And the whole process ended up out of focus, so sorry about that. Then I used my Tamiya gold enamel to paint all the gold bits, before sealing all the non-gold bits with my gloss. And then attaching some silver strings. And we are done! An almost 7-month long project has come to a conclusion, so let's put Ashura together and see how they turned out. And we're done. So, what did you think? I really hope you guys leave me some comments. But I really like how Ashura came out, even though there's some things I wish I could improve on, but I don't have the cooking clue how. So, yeah. But yeah, there might be some iffy things that I'll maybe, who knows, think about later. but I really like how Ashura turned out, and I really hope you guys liked how they turned out. And for those of you that finished watching the video, I really thank you for that. Okay, bye bye!